Sarah Martinez walked through the bustling corridors of Naval Base Coronado with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged, yet remained invisible. At 42, she had mastered the art of blending into her surroundings. Her modest civilian clothes, a simple navy blazer over dark jeans, and comfortable flats, gave no indication of the extraordinary life she had lived or the respect she commanded in the most elite military circles. The base was alive with activity that Tuesday morning in September. Young sailors hurried past carrying files and equipment, their crisp uniforms a stark contrast to Sarah's understated appearance. She nodded politely to those who made eye contact, her warm brown eyes reflecting a kindness that had always been her trademark. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another civilian contractor or perhaps a family member visiting someone stationed at the base. Sarah's appointment was with Commander James Harrison, the base's personnel director, regarding a consulting position with the Navy's Special Operations Training Program. It was work she was uniquely qualified for, though the specifics of her background remained carefully guarded. As she made her way toward the administrative building, she noticed the increased security presence. News reports had mentioned heightened security measures across all military installations following recent global tensions. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete pathways as Sarah approached the main entrance. She paused to show her temporary visitor's badge to the security personnel, who barely glanced at her credentials before waving her through. It was a routine she had grown accustomed to over the years, the anonymity that came with her civilian status, the ability to move through military spaces without drawing attention. Inside the building, the atmosphere was typical of military administration, efficient, purposeful, and slightly sterile. Sarah took a seat in the waiting area outside Commander Harrison's office, observing the steady stream of personnel moving through the hallways. She had always been a keen observer of human behavior, a skill that had served her well throughout her career. A young petty officer approached her with a clipboard. "Ma'am, are you Sarah Martinez? Commander Harrison will see you in just a few minutes. Can I get you some coffee or water while you wait?" "Coffee would be lovely. Thank you," Sarah replied with a smile that put the young sailor immediately at ease. There was something about her presence that made people feel comfortable, as if they were talking to a trusted friend rather than a stranger. As she waited, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 20 years had passed since she had first set foot on a military base as a young Navy recruit, fresh out of college with a degree in international relations and a burning desire to serve her country. Back then, she had been eager, perhaps naive, about the realities of military life and the sacrifices it would demand. Her early years in the Navy had been challenging, but rewarding. Sarah had quickly distinguished herself as someone with an exceptional ability to connect with people from all backgrounds and cultures. This talent, combined with her analytical mind and natural leadership abilities, had caught the attention of her superiors. It wasn't long before she found herself being recruited for specialized training that would take her far from the conventional paths of naval service. The coffee arrived, interrupting her thoughts. The petty officer set the cup down carefully, noting the small pin on Sarah's blazer lapel, a simple design that most would overlook but which held deep significance for those who knew its meaning. "That's a beautiful pin, ma'am," he commented casually. Sarah touched the small silver emblem reflexively. "Thank you. It was a gift from some colleagues," she said simply, not elaborating on the fact that those colleagues included some of the most decorated special operations personnel in the country. Commander Harrison's door opened, and a tall, distinguished man in his mid-50s stepped out. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing that of a career officer who had seen his share of both triumph and tragedy. "Ms. Martinez? I'm Jim Harrison. Thank you for coming in today." Sarah rose and shook his hand firmly. "The pleasure is mine, Commander. I'm looking forward to discussing how I might be able to contribute to your training programs." They settled into Harrison's office, which was decorated with the typical military memorabilia. Unit patches, commendations, photographs of ships and aircraft, and a few personal touches that spoke to a life devoted to service. Harrison poured himself a cup of coffee from a pot on his credenza and gestured for Sarah to make herself comfortable. "I've reviewed your file, Ms. Martinez," Harrison began, though both of them knew that the file he had access to contained only the most basic information about her background. "Your consulting work with various government agencies is impressive, and your recommendations are outstanding. However, I have to admit, some of your experience seems classified." Sarah nodded understanding. "I appreciate your directness, Commander. I can say that much of my previous work has indeed been in sensitive areas that require security clearances. What I can tell you is that I have extensive experience in training elite personnel for high-stress situations, cultural integration, and specialized mission preparation. What Sarah couldn't tell Harrison, and what wasn't in any file he could access, was that she had spent 15 years as one of the Navy's most effective intelligence operatives. Her work had taken her to some of the most dangerous places on Earth, where her ability to blend in and gather critical information had saved countless lives and prevented numerous international incidents. Her specialty had been deep cover operations in regions where traditional military presence would have been impossible or counterproductive. Sarah's linguistic abilities, cultural sensitivity, and remarkable talent for assuming different identities had made her invaluable to the intelligence community. She had operated in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and South America, always managing to extract the information needed while maintaining her cover. The transition to civilian life had been her choice, made after a particularly harrowing mission in Afghanistan that had lasted 8 months and had taken a toll on both her physical and mental health. The Navy had been reluctant to let her go, offering promotions and prestigious assignments, but Sarah had felt the call to step back from active operations. She was tired of living multiple lives, tired of the constant vigilance that field intelligence required. The position we're discussing, Harrison continued, involves working with our most elite units. The training scenarios we develop need to be as realistic as possible, incorporating real-world challenges that these men and women might face in the field. Your background suggests you have the kind of practical experience that could make our programs more effective. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly piqued. Could you tell me more about the specific units I'd be working with? I want to make sure I can provide the most relevant expertise. Primarily Navy SEALs, but also Marine Force Recon, and some joint operations with Army Special Forces, Harrison explained. We're developing new protocols for cultural integration and civilian population interaction in complex operational environments. This was exactly the kind of work Sarah had hoped to transition into, using her hard-won experience to help train the next generation of special operations personnel felt like a natural evolution of her service. It would allow her to contribute without the personal risks that had defined her previous career. That sounds like meaningful work, Commander. I'd be honored to contribute to training programs for those units. Harrison smiled, clearly pleased with her enthusiasm. Excellent. There is one thing I should mention. The SEAL teams here are among the most experienced and decorated in the Navy. They're currently between deployments and using this time for intensive training. You'll be working with men who have seen extensive combat and who have very high standards for anyone involved in their preparation. Sarah appreciated the warning, though she suspected her own standards were likely just as high. I understand, Commander. I have experience working with elite personnel, and I respect the professionalism and dedication required at that level. What neither of them mentioned, because Harrison wasn't aware of it, was that Sarah had already worked with several of the SEAL teams stationed at Coronado during her intelligence career. Those collaborations had been so classified that even now, years later, they remained known only to a handful of individuals with the highest security clearances. The meeting continued for another hour, covering practical details about the consulting arrangement, security requirements, and the timeline for Sarah's involvement. Harrison explained that she would start the following week with an orientation session, during which she would meet the key personnel involved in the training programs. As Sarah prepared to leave, Harrison walked her to the door. I think you're going to be a valuable addition to our team, Ms. Martinez. The feedback I've received about your work has been consistently outstanding. Thank you, Commander. I'm looking forward to getting started. Sarah made her way back through the corridors of the base, retracing her steps toward the main entrance. The morning had progressed into early afternoon, and the base had settled into its usual rhythm of purposeful activity. She found herself thinking about the SEALs she would be working with, wondering if any of them might be familiar faces from her operational days. The possibility both excited and concerned her. While she was proud of the work she had done and the relationships she had built with special operations personnel, she had grown comfortable with her new civilian identity. The thought of potentially explaining her background to people who might remember her from very different circumstances was somewhat daunting. As she approached the parking lot where she had left her modest sedan, Sarah noticed a group of men in naval special warfare uniforms gathering near a training facility. Even at a distance, their bearing was unmistakably that of elite military personnel. They moved with the controlled precision and casual confidence that came from years of intensive training and real-world experience. For a moment, Sarah paused to watch them, feeling a familiar tug of nostalgia for the camaraderie and sense of purpose that had defined her military years. These were the kinds of men she had worked alongside in some of the most challenging circumstances imaginable. They were professionals who understood sacrifice, dedication, and the weight of responsibility that came with their specialized skills. One of the men glanced in her direction, and Sarah quickly continued toward her car. She wasn't ready for any chance encounters just yet. Next week would come soon enough, and with it, the beginning of a new chapter in her ongoing relationship with the military community she had served for so many years. As she drove away from the base, Sarah reflected on the changes in her life and the unexpected ways her experience continued to find new applications. The transition from active intelligence work to civilian consulting hadn't always been easy, but moments like this morning's meeting reminded her that her service had prepared her for challenges she was only beginning to understand. The consulting work would be different from anything she had done before, but it felt right. Training the next generation of special operations personnel was a way of giving back, of ensuring that the lessons learned through her own experiences could benefit others who would carry on the mission of protecting national security. Sarah had always believed that true service extended beyond any single assignment or deployment. It was about using whatever skills and knowledge you possessed to make a positive difference, regardless of whether you wore a uniform or carried a weapon. This new role would allow her to continue serving in a way that felt authentic and meaningful. The drive home gave her time to think about the practical aspects of the new position. She would need to review her notes from various training programs she had observed during her operational years, considering how those lessons might apply to the current security environment. The world had changed significantly since she had first entered military service, and the challenges facing today's special operations personnel were both more complex and more varied than ever before. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment overlooking San Diego Bay, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and orange. The view never failed to calm her, providing a peaceful contrast to the intensity of her professional life. She had chosen this place specifically for its proximity to the naval base, but also for the sense of tranquility it offered. The next week would mark the beginning of an unexpected new phase in her career, one that would challenge her to apply her hard-won experience in ways she had never imagined. Sarah Martinez, the unassuming woman in civilian clothes, was about to step back into the world of elite military operations, though this time her role would be very different from anything she had done before. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that often marked San Diego's autumn weather. Sarah Martinez dressed carefully for her first day as a consultant to the Naval Special Warfare Training Program, choosing professional attire that struck a balance between civilian appropriateness and respect for the military environment she would be entering. Her navy suit was well-tailored, but not ostentatious. Her hair pulled back in a practical style that suggested competence without trying too hard to fit military standards. The drive to Naval Base Coronado felt different this time. Where the previous week's visit had been a simple interview, today marked the beginning of actual work with some of the military's most elite personnel. Sarah found herself both anticipating and slightly apprehensive about the encounters ahead. Her years in intelligence had taught her to read people quickly and adapt to new situations, but this role would require a different kind of interaction than she was accustomed to. Commander Harrison had arranged for her to meet with the training coordinators first, before being introduced to the SEAL teams themselves. This gradual integration was standard procedure, allowing civilian consultants to understand the program structure before interacting directly with operational personnel. Sarah appreciated the thoughtful approach, recognizing the wisdom of establishing her credibility with the support staff before facing the more challenging audience of combat veterans. The training facility was located in a complex of buildings designed specifically for special operations preparation. Unlike the administrative areas Sarah had visited the previous week, these structures had a distinctly functional appearance. The architecture prioritized utility over aesthetics, with high ceilings to accommodate specialized equipment and reinforced construction to withstand the demands of realistic training scenarios. Sarah's first stop was the office of Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells, the primary coordinator for SEAL training programs. Wells was a career Navy officer who had distinguished herself in logistics and personnel management, earning the respect of the special operations community through her meticulous attention to detail and unwavering support for the teams she served. Ms. Martinez, welcome to NSW, Wells said, using the common abbreviation for Naval Special Warfare. I've been looking forward to working with you. Commander Harrison spoke very highly of your background and potential contribution to our programs. Wells' office was a study in organized efficiency. Charts showing training schedules lined the walls, alongside photographs of various SEAL teams and their accomplishments. Her desk held neat stacks of paperwork, multiple computer monitors, and a coffee mug bearing the Special Operations insignia. Thank you, Lieutenant Commander. I'm excited to learn more about your current training methodologies and see how my experience might complement what you're already doing. Over the next 2 hours, Wells provided Sarah with a comprehensive overview of the training programs currently in development. The Navy was adapting its special operations preparation to address emerging global challenges, incorporating lessons learned from recent deployments and intelligence assessments of future threat environments. One area where we particularly need expertise, Wells explained, is in cultural integration scenarios. Our teams are increasingly operating in environments where understanding local populations and customs is as critical as tactical proficiency. Traditional military training doesn't always address the nuances of civilian interaction in complex political situations. This was exactly the kind of challenge Sarah had anticipated, and it aligned perfectly with her background. During her intelligence career, she had spent countless hours studying cultural dynamics and learning to navigate the subtle social complexities that could make or break an operation. The ability to blend with civilian populations while maintaining operational security was a skill she had developed through necessity and refined through experience. I have significant experience in those areas, Sarah replied carefully. Cultural sensitivity and civilian population dynamics were central to much of my previous work with government agencies. Wells nodded approvingly. Excellent. The teams we work with here are exceptionally skilled tactically, but they're always looking for ways to improve their effectiveness in complex operational environments. Your insights could be invaluable. After the briefing with Wells, Sarah was given a tour of the training facilities. The complex included everything from traditional classrooms to sophisticated simulation environments that could replicate virtually any operational scenario. She saw rooms designed to mimic urban environments, complete with detailed street layouts and civilian role players. Other areas featured advanced computer systems that could generate complex tactical scenarios with real-time adaptation based on trainee responses. The technology was impressive, but Sarah's attention was drawn to the human elements of the training environment. Throughout her tour, she observed the interactions between trainers and trainees, noting the mutual respect and professional focus that characterized every exchange. These were serious professionals engaged in preparing for life and death situations, and their dedication was evident in everything they did. During lunch in the facility's cafeteria, Sarah had her first informal interactions with some of the SEAL personnel. The atmosphere was relaxed but purposeful, with conversations ranging from technical discussions about equipment to lighthearted banter about weekend plans. She was struck by how normal these extraordinary individuals seemed in casual conversation, a reminder that behind every elite warrior was a person with the same basic human needs and interests as anyone else. A young SEAL approached her table as she was finishing her meal. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm Petty Officer First Class Mike Rodriguez. Lieutenant Commander Wells mentioned you'd be working with our training programs. I wanted to introduce myself and say we're looking forward to learning from your experience." Sarah was immediately impressed by Rodriguez's professionalism and courtesy. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Petty Officer Rodriguez. I'm Sarah Martinez. I'm looking forward to working with your team and hopefully contributing something useful to your preparation. If you don't mind me asking, what's your background? We don't get many civilian consultants who work directly with our training programs." This was the question Sarah had been expecting and preparing for. "I have experience in international relations and cultural analysis, primarily working with various government agencies on projects involving cross-cultural interaction and civilian population dynamics." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like it could be really valuable. We've been working a lot on scenarios that require interacting with local populations in ways that build trust rather than create problems. It's trickier than it might seem from the outside." "I imagine it is," Sarah agreed. "The balance between maintaining security and building relationships requires a deep understanding of cultural context and individual psychology. It's something that takes practice and constant adaptation." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another SEAL, this one older and bearing the insignia of a senior enlisted leader. Chief Petty Officer David Thompson had the weathered appearance of a career special operations veteran, with 22 years of service that included deployments to virtually every conflict zone of the past 2 decades. Rodriguez, you pestering our new consultant already? Thompson asked with good-natured gruffness. Just introducing myself, Chief. Ms. Martinez was telling me about her background in cultural analysis. Thompson's expression grew more serious as he studied Sarah with the careful attention of someone accustomed to making quick assessments of people in high-stakes situations. Cultural analysis, huh? You work with any of our people before in that capacity? Sarah felt a slight tension in the question, sensing that Thompson was probing for information about her background with the kind of casual interrogation that special operations personnel often employed when evaluating new people. I've worked with various military units over the years, though much of that work was in classified contexts that I can't discuss in detail. Fair enough, Thompson replied, his expression indicating that he understood and respected the limitations on what she could reveal. We appreciate people who understand operational security. Looking forward to seeing what you can teach us. The afternoon brought Sarah's first direct exposure to actual SEAL training in progress. She observed a scenario-based exercise designed to simulate a mission requiring interaction with hostile civilian populations. The complexity of the exercise was remarkable, with role-players portraying various types of civilians, from cooperative informants to actively hostile combatants disguised as non-combatants. What struck Sarah most was how the SEALs approached the exercise with the same intensity and focus they would bring to actual combat operations. There was no casual attitude toward the training, no sense that this was merely practice. Every movement, every decision, every interaction was conducted with the understanding that similar situations in the real world could have life and death consequences. During a break in the exercise, Sarah found herself in conversation with the team leader, Lieutenant Jake Morrison. Morrison was in his early 30s, a Naval Academy graduate who had distinguished himself through multiple deployments and had earned the respect of his men through competent leadership and personal courage. What's your assessment of the scenario? Morrison asked, clearly interested in getting an outside perspective on the training exercise. Sarah had been formulating her thoughts throughout the observation period. The tactical execution is excellent, but I noticed some opportunities for improvement in the cultural interaction aspects. The approach to civilian engagement seems somewhat standardized, when in reality, each cultural context requires different strategies for building trust and gathering information. Morrison listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his genuine interest in improving his team's capabilities. Could you give me a specific example of what you mean? Well, in Middle Eastern cultures, for instance, the approach to male and female civilians needs to be very different, and the social dynamics around authority and respect have specific patterns that can either help or hinder your mission depending on how well you understand them. That makes sense, Morrison replied. We've had situations where our standard procedures seemed to create more problems than they solved, but we weren't always sure why. The ability to read social situations, understand local power dynamics, and adapt communication styles could make the difference between mission success and failure. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself increasingly comfortable with the environment and the people she was working with. The SEALs she encountered were professional, intelligent, and genuinely interested in learning. Their questions were thoughtful and their attitudes respectful, creating an atmosphere that made her feel valued as a contributor rather than tolerated as an outsider. The training exercises continued into the late afternoon, with Sarah observing and occasionally providing input when requested. She was careful not to overstep her role as a consultant, recognizing that these men had far more experience in actual combat operations than she did. Her value lay in providing a different perspective, not in attempting to teach them their jobs. During one particularly complex scenario involving a simulated village environment, Sarah noticed something that caused her to pay closer attention to the team dynamics. The way the SEALs moved and communicated suggested a level of experience that went beyond standard training. These weren't new operators learning basic skills. They were seasoned veterans refining already exceptional capabilities. Lieutenant Morrison approached her after the exercise concluded. Ms. Martinez, would you mind staying a few extra minutes? Chief Thompson wanted to discuss some ideas for incorporating your expertise into our upcoming training cycle. Of course, Sarah replied, though she sensed there was more to the request than simple scheduling. Thompson joined them in a small conference room adjacent to the training area. His demeanor was serious, but not unfriendly, suggesting he wanted to have a more substantive conversation than the casual interactions of earlier in the day. Ms. Martinez, I've been watching you observe our training today, and I get the sense you have more experience with these kinds of operations than your official background might suggest. Sarah felt a familiar tension, the kind that came when someone was probing deeper than she was comfortable going. I'm not sure what you mean, Chief. What I mean is, you watch our exercises like someone who's been in similar situations, not like an academic studying military procedures. Your questions and comments suggest practical experience, not just theoretical knowledge. This was the moment Sarah had been both expecting and dreading. Thompson was clearly an experienced professional who had learned to read people accurately, and he had noticed something in her behavior that suggested more than academic expertise. I do have practical experience in cross-cultural operations, Sarah admitted carefully. Some of that experience was in contexts that I'm not able to discuss in detail. Thompson nodded slowly. I respect that. What I'm trying to figure out is whether we're dealing with someone who can help us improve our training or someone who might actually have experience that could help us understand what we're doing wrong. The distinction was subtle but important. Thompson was asking whether Sarah was a theoretical expert or someone who had actually faced the kinds of challenges the SEALs were training for. It was a question that went to the heart of credibility in the special operations community. Chief, I believe my experience is relevant to your training needs, but I think the best way to demonstrate that is through the quality of the insights I can provide rather than through detailed discussions of my background. Thompson smiled for the first time since the conversation began. Fair enough. I appreciate straight talk, and that's what you're giving me. Let's see what you can teach us. As Sarah prepared to leave the base that evening, she reflected on the day's experiences. The initial interactions had gone better than she had hoped, with the SEAL personnel showing genuine interest in her potential contributions. However, Thompson's probing questions reminded her that maintaining her carefully constructed civilian identity might become increasingly challenging as she worked more closely with these experienced operators. The drive home gave her time to think about the balance she would need to strike between being helpful and protecting her own operational security. While her intelligence background was no longer classified in the strictest sense, there were still aspects of her experience that needed to remain confidential for the protection of ongoing operations and the safety of people still in the field. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, making notes about the day's observations and planning for the next phase of her work with the SEAL training program. The challenge ahead was clear. She needed to provide valuable insights that would genuinely improve the team's capabilities while managing the growing curiosity about her background among people who were professionally skilled at uncovering secrets. 3 weeks into her consulting role, Sarah Martinez had settled into a routine that felt both familiar and strangely new. Each morning brought her to the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility, where she worked with different SEAL teams on scenarios that required cultural sensitivity and civilian interaction skills. The work was challenging and rewarding, allowing her to use her hard-won experience in ways that felt meaningful and constructive. The training scenarios had become increasingly sophisticated as the teams incorporated her suggestions. Where once they had relied on standardized protocols for civilian interaction, they were now learning to adapt their approaches based on specific cultural contexts and situational dynamics. Sarah had developed a series of exercises that challenged the SEALs to think beyond tactical considerations and consider the psychological and social factors that could influence mission success. On this particular Wednesday morning, Sarah was preparing for what had become her most challenging assignment yet. Lieutenant Commander Wells had asked her to work with SEAL Team 7, a unit that had recently returned from a deployment in Southeast Asia and was preparing for their next mission cycle. Team 7 had a reputation for exceptional operational success, but they had also encountered some difficulties with civilian population management during their recent deployment. The team's commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Marcus Stone, a 15-year veteran who had earned multiple decorations for valor and leadership. Stone was known for his analytical approach to operations and his willingness to seek out expertise that could improve his team's effectiveness. When Wells had briefed him about Sarah's background and the improvements other teams had shown after working with her, he had specifically requested her assistance. Sarah arrived at the training facility early, wanting to review her notes and prepare for what she suspected would be a more intensive evaluation than she had faced with previous teams. Team 7's reputation preceded them, and she knew they would be more demanding in their assessment of her expertise. The team assembled in a conference room that had been configured to resemble a village meeting space, complete with appropriate furniture and cultural artifacts. The 12 men who comprised Team 7's core operational element filed in with the quiet professionalism that marked all elite units. But Sarah could sense an additional level of intensity in their demeanor. Lieutenant Commander Stone was a compact, athletic man in his late 30s with the kind of calm presence that suggested extensive combat experience. His introduction was brief and to the point. MS. Martinez, my team, and I appreciate you taking the time to work with us. We've heard good things about the training you've been providing to other units, and we're interested in learning what you can teach us about civilian population dynamics. Sarah noticed that Stone's phrasing was careful and specific. Rather than asking about cultural sensitivity in general terms, he had focused on population dynamics, suggesting a more sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in civilian interaction during military operations. Thank you, Commander Stone. I'm looking forward to working with your team. I understand you've recently returned from operations in Southeast Asia. Would it be helpful to focus our exercises on scenarios similar to those you might encounter in that region? That would be excellent, Stone replied. We had some situations during our last deployment where our standard procedures didn't achieve the results we wanted. We're hoping you can help us understand why and how we might do better next time. The team's senior enlisted leader, Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Hayes, stepped forward. Hayes was a 24-year veteran whose chest ribbons told the story of a career spent in the world's most dangerous places. His weathered face bore the marks of someone who had seen combat in multiple theaters, and his eyes held the watchful intelligence that characterized the most experienced special operations personnel. Ma'am, before we get started, could you tell us a little more about your experience in the regions we're likely to be operating in? My boys, and I want to make sure we're learning from someone who understands the ground truth of what we're dealing with. The question was politely phrased but carried an unmistakable challenge. Hayes was asking Sarah to establish her credibility before investing the team's time and attention in her instruction. It was a reasonable request from professionals who couldn't afford to waste time on theoretical knowledge that might not apply to real-world situations. Sarah had anticipated this moment and had prepared a response that would provide enough detail to establish credibility without revealing classified information. Master Chief, I've spent considerable time working in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe in various capacities related to cultural analysis and civilian population assessment. Much of that work involved direct interaction with local communities under challenging security conditions. Hayes studied her for a long moment, his experience noting details that most people would miss. You move like someone who's been in dangerous places, he observed quietly. And you choose your words like someone who's used to protecting operational security. Sarah felt a familiar spike of alertness. Hayes was clearly more perceptive than most, and he was reading her behavior with the skill of someone who had survived decades in special operations by being able to assess people accurately and quickly. I've worked in environments where security was a concern, she acknowledged, keeping her response measured and truthful without being revealing. Lieutenant Commander Stone intervened smoothly. Master Chief, I think the best way to evaluate Ms. Martinez's expertise is to see what she can teach us. We have limited time before our next training cycle begins, so let's focus on making the most of the opportunity we have. The exercises that followed were among the most challenging Sarah had yet designed. Working with Team 7's actual operational experiences, she created scenarios that replicated the specific cultural and situational dynamics they had encountered during their deployment. The team approached each exercise with the intensity of actual operations, testing Sarah's guidance against their own hard-won experience. What emerged over the course of the morning was a complex picture of the challenges facing special operations forces in modern conflicts. The traditional model of military engagement, based on clear distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, had given way to a much more nuanced environment where success often depended on understanding subtle social dynamics and cultural sensitivities. During one particularly complex scenario involving a simulated village elder meeting, Petty Officer First Class Tommy Chun raised a question that got to the heart of the challenges they faced. Ms. Martinez, in the real world, we're often dealing with people who may be helping us during the day and shooting at us at night. How do you read those situations when the cultural signals are deliberately deceptive? The question demonstrated the sophistication of the challenges these operators faced and the quality of their thinking about civilian interaction. Sarah realized she was working with professionals who had encountered some of the most complex operational environments in the world and had developed their own insights through difficult experience. That's an excellent question, Petty Officer Chin. What you're describing is one of the most challenging aspects of modern conflict environments. The key is learning to distinguish between cultural behaviors that are genuine and those that are performed for your benefit. Sarah spent the next hour explaining techniques for reading microexpressions, body language, and social dynamics that could provide clues about genuine attitudes versus deceptive behavior. Much of what she taught came from her own operational experience, though she continued to frame it in terms of academic research and theoretical analysis. As the training session progressed, Sarah noticed that the team members were asking increasingly sophisticated questions that suggested they were testing her knowledge against their own operational experience. They were clearly evaluating whether her expertise was theoretical or practical, and whether her insights would actually help them in real-world situations. Master Chief Hayes seemed particularly focused on this evaluation. During a break between exercises, he approached Sarah with a direct question that she had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. Ms. Martinez, I've been listening to your instruction today, and I have to say, you talk about these situations like someone who's actually been in them. Your examples are too specific, and your understanding of the emotional dynamics too accurate for someone who's only studied these things academically. Sarah felt the familiar tension that came when her carefully constructed cover story was being challenged by someone with the skills to see through it. Hayes was clearly drawing on decades of experience in reading people and situations, and he had identified something in her presentation that suggested practical rather than theoretical knowledge. Master Chief, as I mentioned earlier, my experience includes direct work in various operational environments. I've been fortunate to work with many military units over the years, and that experience has given me insights that go beyond academic study. Hayes nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with her response. I respect operational security, ma'am, and I'm not trying to put you in a difficult position. What I am trying to figure out is whether we're dealing with someone who can help us or someone who might actually understand what we're going through better than most of the people who are supposed to be training us. The distinction was subtle but crucial. Hayes was asking whether Sarah was just another consultant with theoretical knowledge or someone who had actually faced the kinds of challenges his team dealt with on a regular basis. It was a question about credibility and authenticity in a community where both were essential for effective communication. Before Sarah could respond, Lieutenant Commander Stone called the team back to resume training. The timing provided a welcome respite from Hayes' probing questions, but Sarah knew the issue hadn't been resolved. She would need to find a way to balance transparency with security if she wanted to maintain her effectiveness with this highly experienced team. The afternoon exercises focused on advanced scenarios that tested the team's ability to adapt their civilian interaction techniques to rapidly changing situations. Sarah introduced concepts she had learned during her intelligence career about reading group dynamics, identifying key influencers in local populations, and adapting communication styles to match cultural expectations. What impressed her most was how quickly the team absorbed and applied her instruction. These were professionals who had spent years honing their ability to learn new skills quickly and apply them under pressure. They approached her teaching with the same intensity they brought to weapons training or tactical exercises. During one exercise involving a simulated negotiation with hostile tribal leaders, Petty Officer Second Class Alex Rodriguez demonstrated an exceptional ability to apply Sarah's guidance about cultural authority structures. His performance was so sophisticated that Sarah found herself wondering about his own background and experience. Outstanding work, Petty Officer Rodriguez, she commented after the exercise concluded. You showed excellent instincts for reading the power dynamics in that situation. Rodriguez smiled modestly. Thank you, ma'am. Your explanation of how authority works in traditional societies really helped me understand what I was seeing. I've been in similar situations before, but I didn't really understand why some approaches worked and others didn't. This comment sparked a broader discussion among the team members about their operational experiences and the lessons they had learned through trial and error. As Sarah listened to their accounts, she found herself impressed by their professionalism and their commitment to continuous improvement. More troubling, however, was her growing realization that several of the situations they described were ones she recognized from her own operational experience. The geographic locations, the timeframes, and some of the specific details suggested that she and Team 7 might have operated in some of the same areas during overlapping periods. This possibility created a new set of challenges for Sarah. If any of the team members had been involved in operations where her intelligence work had played a role, they might eventually connect her current identity with her previous activities. The special operations community was relatively small, and information about successful intelligence gathering often circulated among the units that benefited from it. As the day's training concluded, Master Chief Hayes approached Sarah one more time. His manner was respectful but insistent, suggesting he was determined to resolve his questions about her background. Ms. Martinez, I want to thank you for an excellent day of training. My team learned a lot, and I can already see how your insights will improve our effectiveness. However, I'd like to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll give me a straight answer. Sarah braced herself for what was coming, recognizing that Hayes had probably spent the day formulating his approach to this conversation. During your career, have you ever worked directly with Navy Special Operations Forces in an operational capacity? I'm not asking for details about classified activities, but I think it would help us understand your perspective if we knew whether you've actually been in the field with people like us. The question was carefully phrased to respect security requirements while still seeking the information Hayes wanted. He was asking for confirmation that Sarah's expertise came from practical experience rather than academic study, and he was doing so in a way that acknowledged the constraints she operated under. Sarah realized that continuing to evade the question would only damage her credibility with a team that clearly respected direct communication. At the same time, she needed to be careful about revealing information that could compromise ongoing operations or the safety of people still in the field. Master Chief, I have worked with various special operations units in support capacities over the years. Much of that work is still classified, and I'm limited in what I can say about specific operations or locations. What I can tell you is that my understanding of the challenges you face comes from practical experience, not just academic study. Hayes studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. I appreciate your honesty, ma'am. That's what I thought, and it explains why your instruction today was so valuable. We've worked with a lot of consultants over the years, and most of them don't understand what we actually deal with in the field. As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on the day's events and the growing complexity of her position. Her work with the SEAL teams was proving more challenging than she had anticipated, not because of the technical demands, but because of the need to maintain her carefully constructed civilian identity while working with people who were professionally skilled at uncovering secrets. The quality of her interaction with Team 7 had been excellent, and she was confident that her instruction would improve their operational effectiveness. However, the probing questions from Hayes and the team's sophisticated understanding of operational environments suggested that her background was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. Sarah knew that eventually, someone would make the connection between her current consulting work and her previous intelligence activities. When that happened, she would need to decide how to handle the revelation and what it might mean for her carefully planned transition to civilian life. 6 weeks into her consulting assignment, Sarah Martinez had established herself as one of the most valued civilian instructors in the Naval Special Warfare Training Program. Her work with various SEAL teams had produced measurable improvements in their civilian interaction capabilities, and word of her effectiveness had spread throughout the special operations community at Coronado. On this crisp November morning, Sarah was preparing for what she expected to be a routine training session with a newly formed team that was preparing for deployment to Africa. The geographic and cultural challenges of that continent required specialized preparation, and Sarah had been asked to develop scenarios that would help the team understand the complex tribal and political dynamics they might encounter. She arrived at the training facility to find Lieutenant Commander Wells waiting for her with an expression that suggested something had changed in the day's plans. Wells was typically composed and professional, but this morning she seemed somewhat tense, as if she were dealing with an unexpected complication. Good morning, Ms. Martinez. I need to speak with you about today's training session before you meet with the team. Sarah followed Wells into her office, noting that the usual morning bustle of activity seemed subdued. There was an atmosphere of heightened attention that suggested something significant was happening, though she couldn't immediately identify what had changed. Is there a problem with the training schedule? Sarah asked, settling into the chair across from Wells' desk. Not exactly a problem, but there has been a development that might affect your work today. We've had a request from Admiral Richardson, the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, to observe today's training session. Sarah felt a slight spike of alertness at the mention of Admiral Richardson. She knew of him by reputation, a highly decorated career officer who had commanded special operations forces in multiple theaters and who was known for his hands-on approach to training and personnel development. His interest in observing a routine training session was unusual, and suggested there was more to the situation than Wells was initially revealing. I see. Is there any particular reason for the Admiral's interest in today's session? Wells hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Admiral Richardson has been following the reports about the improvements in team performance that have resulted from your training programs. He's apparently quite interested in seeing your methods firsthand and possibly expanding the program to other units. While this explanation made sense on the surface, Sarah's operational instincts told her there was additional information that Wells either couldn't or wouldn't share. The decision to have a flag officer observe a training session suggested a level of interest that went beyond routine program evaluation. I appreciate the Admiral's confidence in the program, Sarah replied. Is there anything specific he'll be looking for, or should I conduct the session normally? Just proceed with your planned exercises. The Admiral is particularly interested in how you integrate cultural analysis with practical training scenarios. An hour later, Sarah was setting up the training area when she heard the unmistakable sound of senior officers arriving. Admiral Richardson entered the facility accompanied by his aide and chief of staff, their presence immediately noticeable to everyone in the area. The Admiral was an imposing figure in his early 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in positions of command and responsibility. The SEAL team scheduled for training filed into the area with their usual professionalism, though Sarah noticed they were clearly aware of the high-level observation. The team leader, Lieutenant Patrick Murphy, approached Sarah with a slight smile that suggested he was accustomed to performing under scrutiny. Ms. Martinez, I understand we have some distinguished observers today. My team is ready to proceed with whatever exercises you have planned. Sarah had worked with Murphy's team before during their preparation phase, and she knew them to be highly competent professionals who would perform well regardless of who was watching. The scenarios she had prepared focused on the complex ethnic and political dynamics of East Africa, where the team would likely be operating within a few months. As the exercises began, Sarah was aware of Admiral Richardson's attention, but tried to focus on providing the same quality of instruction she delivered during every training session. The scenarios were sophisticated, requiring the team to navigate situations involving multiple tribal groups, government officials, and international aid organizations, all while maintaining their operational security and mission focus. What Sarah didn't notice during the early part of the session was that Admiral Richardson seemed to be paying as much attention to her instruction methods and background knowledge as he was to the team's performance. His questions to his aide and chief of staff suggested he was evaluating her expertise with the careful attention of someone who had specific criteria in mind. Halfway through the morning's exercises, during a break between scenarios, Admiral Richardson approached Sarah directly. His manner was cordial, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. Ms. Martinez, I've been observing your instruction this morning, and I'm impressed by the sophistication of your scenarios and the practical applicability of your guidance. Your understanding of regional dynamics is quite detailed. Sarah felt the familiar caution that came whenever senior military leaders showed particular interest in her work. Thank you, Admiral. I've tried to make the training as realistic as possible based on current intelligence assessments and historical patterns in the region. Richardson nodded thoughtfully. Your analysis of tribal power structures and their interaction with government authorities is particularly accurate. It suggests you have access to very current and detailed intelligence about the political situation in that part of Africa. This comment raised Sarah's level of alertness significantly. Richardson's observation was accurate. Her scenarios did incorporate very current intelligence, but his comment suggested he was wondering how a civilian consultant would have access to that level of detailed information. I try to stay current with open-source intelligence and academic analysis of regional developments, Sarah replied carefully. Of course, Richardson said, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with that explanation. Would you mind if I asked about your background? Commander Harrison mentioned you have experience with various government agencies, but the specifics seem to be somewhat classified. Sarah realized she was facing the kind of direct inquiry from senior leadership that she had been hoping to avoid. Admiral Richardson was clearly someone with the experience and authority to look more deeply into her background if he chose to do so, and his question suggested he had already begun that process. Admiral, much of my previous work was indeed in classified contexts that limit what I can discuss publicly. I can say that I have extensive experience in cultural analysis and regional studies that has proven applicable to special operations training. Richardson studied her for a long moment with the penetrating gaze of someone who had spent decades evaluating personnel in high-stakes situations. Ms. Martinez, would you mind if we continued this conversation after the training session concludes? I'd like to discuss some possibilities for expanding your role in our training programs. The request was politely phrased but carried the unmistakable tone of a command. Sarah agreed, though she wondered what had prompted Richardson's particular interest in her background and whether her carefully maintained civilian identity was about to face its most serious challenge yet. The remainder of the training session proceeded smoothly, with Murphy's team demonstrating excellent adaptation to Sarah's guidance. However, she was increasingly aware of Richardson's continued observation and the sense that she was being evaluated for something beyond her current consulting role. After the team was dismissed, Sarah found herself in a small conference room with Admiral Richardson, his Chief of Staff Captain Morrison, and Lieutenant Commander Wells. The atmosphere was professional but formal, suggesting this was more than a casual conversation about training programs. Ms. Martinez, Richardson began, I want to begin by saying that your work with our teams has been exceptional. The improvements in civilian interaction capabilities that we've documented since you began consulting with us are significant and measurable. Sarah acknowledged the compliment while wondering where the conversation was heading. However, Richardson continued, I'm curious about the source of your expertise. Your understanding of operational environments and cultural dynamics suggests practical experience rather than academic study. Your scenarios incorporate details that would typically be available only to people with specific security clearances and operational backgrounds. This was the moment Sarah had been preparing for since she began the consulting work. Richardson was clearly suspicious about her background and was using his authority to investigate further. She needed to decide how much she could reveal without compromising ongoing operations or her own security. Admiral, I appreciate your directness. You're correct that my experience includes practical work in operational environments. Much of my career was spent in intelligence analysis and field operations that required cultural integration and civilian population assessment. Richardson leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. Intelligence analysis? What agency? Navy intelligence, primarily, though I also worked with other agencies on joint operations. Captain Morrison, who had been silent until this point, spoke up. What was your rank and specialty code? Sarah realized that continuing to be evasive would only create more suspicion and might actually compromise her position more than controlled disclosure. I was a lieutenant commander in naval intelligence, specialty code 1630, specializing in human intelligence operations and cultural analysis. The room fell silent for a moment as the three officers processed this information. Richardson's expression showed recognition and surprise in equal measure. Lieutenant Commander Martinez, Richardson said slowly. Sarah Martinez, Naval Intelligence, Human Intelligence Operations. He paused, clearly searching his memory. Were you involved in Operation Desert Storm intelligence preparation in 2003? Sarah felt a sinking sensation as she realized Richardson might have been in a position to know about her operational activities. Admiral, some of my work was related to Iraqi intelligence assessment during that period. Richardson's expression suddenly changed to one of recognition and respect. Captain Morrison, could you check the classified personnel database for Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, Naval Intelligence, circa 2003 to 2018? Morrison pulled out a secure tablet and began accessing databases that Sarah knew contained detailed records of intelligence personnel and their operational activities. After a few minutes of searching, his expression showed the same recognition that had appeared on Richardson's face. Admiral, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, decorated intelligence officer, multiple combat deployments, specialized in deep cover cultural integration operations. Commendations for exceptional service in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. Classified citation for operations that prevented significant international incidents. Richardson turned back to Sarah with an expression that had transformed from curiosity to deep respect. Ms. Martinez, or should I say Commander Martinez, you conducted the intelligence operation that provided the tribal leader assessments for our operation in Kandahar province in 2007. Sarah realized that her carefully guarded secret was now fully exposed. Richardson clearly had personal knowledge of operations that had involved her intelligence work, and there was no point in continuing to maintain her civilian cover story. Yes, Admiral. I was responsible for the cultural assessment and tribal leader analysis for that operation. Commander, that intelligence work saved the lives of 2 SEAL platoons and enabled one of the most successful special operations missions of that deployment. The cultural insights you provided were instrumental in gaining tribal cooperation and avoiding civilian casualties. The revelation completely changed the dynamic in the room. Where moments before Sarah had been a civilian consultant of uncertain background, she was now revealed as a decorated naval officer whose intelligence work had directly supported Special Operations Forces in combat. "Admiral," Sarah said carefully, "I transitioned to civilian status in 2019 after completing my operational service. I've been trying to maintain a low profile while using my experience to support training programs." Richardson nodded understanding. "Commander, your desire for privacy is completely understandable, and your transition to civilian life is your choice to make. However, I think you should know that your operational work is still remembered and respected throughout the special operations community." Captain Morrison looked up from his tablet. "Admiral, there are multiple citations in her file from SEAL team commanders who worked with intelligence she provided. The feedback is universally outstanding." Richardson smiled for the first time since the conversation began. "Commander Martinez, I have a question for you. Given what you've accomplished in just a few weeks of consulting work, would you consider taking on a more formal role in our training programs? Your operational experience could be invaluable in preparing our teams for the complex environments they're facing." Sarah found herself at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated. Her plan had been to maintain her civilian consulting role while gradually transitioning away from any involvement with military operations. However, Richardson's offer suggested an opportunity to contribute to special operations training in ways she hadn't considered. "Admiral, what kind of role are you thinking about?" "We're developing a new training center focused specifically on cultural integration and civilian population interaction. We need someone with both operational experience and instructional capability to lead the program development. It would be a civilian position, but with direct access to classified intelligence and the authority to design training programs for all special operations units." The offer was both flattering and challenging. It would allow Sarah to use her experience in meaningful ways while maintaining her civilian status, but it would also require her to step back into a more prominent role in the special operations community. As Sarah considered her response, she realized that her carefully planned anonymity had come to an end, but perhaps in a way that would allow her to contribute more effectively than she had ever imagined. 2 months had passed since Admiral Richardson's revelation of Sarah's true identity, and the transformation in her role at Naval Special Warfare Command had been remarkable. What had begun as discreet consulting work had evolved into the leadership of an entirely new training initiative that was attracting attention from special operations commands across all service branches. The Advanced Cultural Integration Training Center was taking shape in a dedicated facility at Naval Base Coronado, with Sarah serving as its first civilian director. The position allowed her to apply her operational experience on a scale she had never imagined, developing training programs that would benefit thousands of special operations personnel over the coming years. On this particular Friday morning in January, Sarah was preparing for the center's official dedication ceremony. The event would mark the formal recognition of the program's importance to special operations training and would be attended by senior leadership from across the military's elite units. For Sarah, it represented both a culmination of her transition from operational service and the beginning of a new chapter in her ongoing commitment to national security. She stood before the mirror in her apartment, adjusting the dark blue suit she had chosen for the ceremony. The outfit was professional and dignified, appropriate for someone in her new civilian leadership role, yet she felt a strange nostalgia for the Navy uniform she had worn for so many years. Today would mark one of the first formal military ceremonies she had attended as a civilian, and the symbolism wasn't lost on her. The drive to the base was familiar now, but today felt different. Media representatives would be present to document the ceremony, and several members of Congress had confirmed their attendance, reflecting the political importance of improving special operations training. Sarah had spent the previous evening reviewing her remarks for the dedication, wanting to strike the right balance between acknowledging the program's importance and maintaining the operational security that remained crucial to special operations effectiveness. Upon arriving at the facility, Sarah was struck by the transformation that had taken place over the past 2 months. What had been a collection of underutilized buildings was now a state-of-the-art training center with sophisticated simulation capabilities, cultural immersion environments, and advanced technology for creating realistic operational scenarios. The speed of the transformation reflected the priority that senior leadership had placed on improving cultural integration training. Lieutenant Commander Wells approached Sarah as she entered the main building. "Good morning, Director Martinez. Everything is ready for the ceremony. Admiral Richardson would like to meet with you briefly before the formal program begins." Sarah found Richardson in his temporary office, reviewing the ceremony program with his chief of staff. He looked up as she entered, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone who had seen an important initiative come to fruition. "Sarah," Richardson said, using her first name in a way that reflected their evolving professional relationship, "I wanted to thank you again for taking on this challenge. What you've accomplished in such a short time has exceeded all our expectations." "Thank you, Admiral. It's been incredibly rewarding to see the program develop and to watch the teams respond to the new training approaches." Richardson nodded thoughtfully. "I've been receiving reports from commanders throughout the special operations community about the effectiveness of personnel who have completed your training programs. The feedback is universally positive." This was gratifying news for Sarah, confirming that her transition from operational intelligence work to training development had achieved its intended purpose. The real measure of success in special operations training was always operational effectiveness, and knowing that her work was improving real-world performance validated the entire initiative. "Admiral, there is one thing I wanted to discuss with you before the ceremony begins," Sarah said. "I've been thinking about expanding the program to include training for intelligence personnel who work with special operations units. My experience suggests there are opportunities to improve coordination between intelligence and operational elements." Richardson's interest was immediately evident. "That's an excellent idea. The integration between intelligence and operations has always been one of our biggest challenges. Your background gives you a unique perspective on how to improve that relationship." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Morrison, who informed them that the ceremony guests were arriving and that it was time to begin the formal program. Sarah felt a familiar pre-performance nervousness, though she had spoken at countless briefings and presentations during her career. The dedication ceremony was held in the center's main training hall, which had been configured to accommodate the various dignitaries and media representatives attending the event. Sarah was struck by the diversity of the audience, not just Navy personnel, but representatives from Army Special Forces, Marine Force Recon, Air Force Special Operations, and various intelligence agencies. As she took her place at the speaker's table, Sarah noticed several familiar faces in the audience. Master Chief Hayes from SEAL Team 7 was present, along with Lieutenant Commander Stone and several other officers she had worked with during her early consulting days. Their presence reminded her of how far she had come from those initial training sessions when she was still maintaining her civilian cover story. Admiral Richardson opened the ceremony with remarks about the importance of cultural understanding in modern special operations. His speech emphasized how the changing nature of conflict required new approaches to training that went beyond traditional military skills to include sophisticated understanding of human dynamics and cultural sensitivity. "The challenges facing our special operations forces today are unlike anything we have encountered in previous generations," Richardson explained to the audience. "Success in contemporary operations often depends as much on our ability to understand and interact effectively with civilian populations as it does on our tactical proficiency." When Richardson introduced Sarah to address the audience, she felt a moment of pride mixed with humility. 2 years ago, she had been operating under deep cover in dangerous environments where her survival depended on absolute anonymity. Today, she was being publicly recognized for her contributions to special operations training. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, "the Advanced Cultural Integration Training Center represents more than just a new facility or a new program. It represents our commitment to ensuring that the men and women who serve in our most elite units have every possible advantage when they face the complex challenges of modern operations." Her remarks focused on the importance of understanding that every military operation, no matter how tactical, took place within a human context that could influence its success or failure. She emphasized that cultural sensitivity wasn't about political correctness or academic theory, but about operational effectiveness and mission success. "The warriors who graduate from our special operations training programs are among the most capable and dedicated professionals in the world," Sarah continued. "Our job is to ensure that their exceptional tactical skills are complemented by equally sophisticated understanding of the human environments in which they operate." As Sarah spoke, she noticed that several of the SEAL personnel in the audience were listening with the intense attention that characterized their approach to any training that might improve their effectiveness. These were professionals who understood that every advantage, no matter how subtle, could make the difference between mission success and failure. The formal portion of the ceremony concluded with a ribbon cutting that officially opened the training center. Sarah stood alongside Admiral Richardson and the other dignitaries, feeling a sense of accomplishment that was different from anything she had experienced during her operational career. Where her intelligence work had been necessarily secret and often unacknowledged, this achievement was public and would have lasting impact on the special operations community. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by numerous attendees who wanted to discuss the training programs and explore opportunities for their own units. The level of interest was gratifying and suggested that the center would quickly expand beyond its initial Navy focus to serve the broader special operations community. During the reception that followed the dedication, Sarah found herself in conversation with Congressman Robert Hayes, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee's Special Operations Subcommittee. Hayes was a former Army Ranger who had maintained close ties to the special operations community throughout his political career. Director Martinez, Hayes said, "I've been following the development of this program with great interest. The early reports suggest you've achieved something remarkable in a very short time." "Thank you, Congressman. We've been fortunate to work with exceptional personnel who were eager to incorporate new approaches into their training." Hayes nodded approvingly. "What impresses me most is that you've managed to improve training effectiveness while maintaining the operational security that's so crucial to special operations success. That's a difficult balance to achieve." This observation reflected one of the key challenges Sarah had faced in developing the training programs. Realistic cultural integration training required detailed scenarios based on actual operational environments. But those scenarios had to be designed carefully to avoid revealing sensitive information about ongoing operations or intelligence capabilities. As the reception continued, Sarah noticed Master Chief Hayes from SEAL Team 7 approaching with several of his teammates. She had been wondering whether any of her former training participants would attend the ceremony, and she was pleased to see familiar faces among the guests. "Director Martinez," Hayes said with genuine warmth, "my team wanted to thank you personally for the training you provided. We've had the opportunity to apply what we learned during a recent deployment, and I can tell you that your instruction made a real difference in our effectiveness." This was the kind of feedback that made all the challenges of developing the training center worthwhile. Knowing that her work had contributed to operational success and potentially saved lives was deeply satisfying. Petty Officer Rodriguez, whom Sarah remembered from her early training sessions, stepped forward. "Ma'am, the cultural awareness techniques you taught us helped us establish relationships with local leaders that were crucial to our mission success. We wanted you to know that your training had real-world impact." As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself reflecting on the unexpected trajectory her career had taken. 2 years ago, she had been planning a quiet transition to civilian life, hoping to use her experience in modest consulting roles while maintaining her anonymity. Instead, she had become the public face of a major training initiative that was transforming how the military prepared its most elite personnel. The ceremony was nearing its conclusion when Admiral Richardson approached her with a request that surprised her. "Sarah, there's one more element to today's ceremony that I haven't mentioned. I'd like to ask you to join me for a brief additional presentation." Sarah followed Richardson to the front of the assembly, uncertain what he had in mind. The audience, which had been dispersing after the formal program, reassembled as Richardson called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude today's ceremony, I want to recognize Director Martinez for something beyond her current contributions to our training programs." Richardson turned to face Sarah directly. "Commander Martinez, while you are now serving in a civilian capacity, your previous service to our nation and to the special operations community deserves recognition that it has never properly received." Sarah felt a surge of nervousness as she realized that Richardson was about to acknowledge her intelligence career in a public forum. While her background was no longer secret among senior military leadership, public recognition was something she hadn't anticipated or necessarily wanted. During your 15 years of operational service with Navy intelligence, you conducted operations that directly supported special operations forces in some of the most challenging environments our military has faced, Richardson continued. Your intelligence work saved lives, prevented international incidents, and contributed to mission success in ways that can never be fully acknowledged publicly. Richardson paused, looking around the assembly of special operations personnel. "What I can say is that Commander Martinez exemplified the highest traditions of naval service, and Her transition to civilian leadership of our training programs represents a continuation of that service rather than a departure from it. To Sarah's complete astonishment, Richardson stepped back and rendered a crisp military salute. More surprising still was what happened next. Throughout the assembly, every uniformed military member, from junior enlisted personnel to senior officers, stood and saluted in recognition of her service. The sight of dozens of elite special operations personnel saluting her was overwhelming. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as she realized that her years of anonymous service were finally being acknowledged by the community she had devoted her career to supporting. Among those saluting were the SEAL team members she had trained, the officers she had worked with during her consulting period, and senior leaders who had benefited from her intelligence work without ever knowing her identity. The salute represented not just recognition of her past service, but acceptance of her continued contributions to the Special Operations community. Master Chief Hayes stepped forward as the salutes concluded. Director Martinez, on behalf of all the operators here today, I want to thank you for your service, both past and present. What you've built here will make us better at what we do, and that means better at protecting our country and bringing our people home safely. As the ceremony finally concluded and guests began to depart, Sarah found herself deeply moved by the recognition she had received. Her carefully planned transition to civilian life had taken an unexpected turn, leading her to a role she couldn't have imagined, but that felt perfectly suited to her skills and experience. Admiral Richardson approached her as the last of the guests were leaving. Sarah, I hope today's recognition wasn't too overwhelming. I felt it was important for the community to understand who you are and what you've contributed. Admiral, I'm grateful for the recognition, though it was certainly unexpected. What matters most to me is that the training center will continue to improve the effectiveness of our special operations forces. Richardson smiled. Given what you've accomplished so far, I have no doubt that this is just the beginning. The center you've built will influence special operations training for decades to come. As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. What had begun as an attempt to maintain anonymity while contributing modestly to military training had evolved into public leadership of a major training initiative that was already having measurable impact on special operations effectiveness. The recognition she had received from the special operations community represented something she had never expected: public acknowledgement of service that had necessarily been conducted in secret. More importantly, it confirmed that her transition from operational service to training development had been successful in ways that extended far beyond her original expectations. Sarah Martinez, the woman who had once moved through military facilities unrecognized and unnoticed, had found a new way to serve that honored both her past contributions and her future potential. The Advanced Cultural Integration Training Center would stand as a lasting testament to the importance of understanding that even the most elite military operations succeeded or failed based on their ability to navigate the complex human environments in which they took place. As she watched the sun set over San Diego Bay, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Her service to the country continued, but now in a way that allowed her to be recognized for her contributions while making a lasting difference in the preparation of America's most elite warriors. The journey from secret operative to public leader had been unexpected, but it had led her to exactly where she belonged.